So this is, I'm talking with David Swanson. He's an author of a number of books, two of which I've read, which is War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. And the most recent book is War No More, A Case for the Abolition. David Swanson, one of the things I wanted to do, I know you've been in a number of interviews. You had one this morning with KBOO. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, in all these interviews you've done, is there a question that people forget to ask you? Is there one that you think that needs to be asked and that you want to tell?
Maybe that one. That's a new one, you know. There's almost no new ones, and that's a new one. Yes, I've been talking all day, so forgive me if I say something twice or I forget to say something, but you know, most of the questions I expect and I know how to answer. The question I want people to ask is, what can I do? What action do I take next? And usually, most good events where there's lengthy question, like face-to-face events more than radio shows with callers, somebody does ask that. I don't know. I think there are, going in depth into that, there are all sorts of questions that develop about how should we organize a broader movement? How do I reach this particular constituency? How do I get human rights groups involved in anti-war? How do I get civil liberties or environmental groups involved in anti-war? How do we build a movement that's international but challenges the heart and soul of war making that is in Washington, D.C.? I mean, all of these sorts of strategic questions about how do we do it is where I want to get to.
Right.
Of course, I'm dealing with the questions about, how do we handle the next Hitler and how can we be safe if we disarm and this sort of stuff. And, if we can get past those, there's a whole range of new questions to get to.
Well, I do a cable access program once a month, and it's called Veterans for Peace Forum. And usually when I try to interview people, I just want to have a conversation. I want to get to know them so that my audience gets to know them. And one of the first questions I ask is, where were you raised? Where'd you grow up?
Well, I was born in New York City, lived in New Jersey till I was 2, and after that grew up in Northern Virginia, which is, suburbs of Washington, D.C., but a ways outside of Washington, D.C. And I lived there until I finished high school, and then went to Europe for a year, went to college in North Carolina and New York, and then back in Virginia for graduate school with some more time spent in Europe in between, and
so what was your area in graduate school?
Philosophy. Master's in philosophy.
Oh, great.
At Virginia.
There was, what did your parents do?
Well, it's interesting. They were something of activists in the 60s, civil rights and so forth, but they were studying at a theological seminary in New York, and my dad was a preacher and my mom was an organist, and they quit and abandoned that when I was 2, when we moved. And my dad taught himself construction and did that, and so a good change in career there when I was a little kid. But they were not. It was not a military family. It was not an anti-military family. It was wonderful parents, wonderful family, but not activist. I didn't grow up as a Quaker activist or in a Catholic worker house or anything of the sort. I grew up in a pretty typical home.
But where did you feel you got your sort of feelings about war and peace, justice? Yeah. I mean, it seems like that would come from your family in a sense.
I'll never give you a satisfactory answer to this. I've never given one to anybody else. You can ask me all night and it will just build your frustration because I don't have that story. I was never pro-war, so I never had to have this Paul on the road conversion, So I was asked to write a chapter in a book on this topic, and the best story I could come up with was when a cousin of mine came to visit us and wanted to go see the Naval Academy, wanted to maybe go there when he was older. And we went over to Annapolis, beautiful sunny day, sailboats, shoppers on the street, and this massive institution dedicated to training people to go off and commit murder. And I felt I got physically ill at the thought of it. I mean, this was when I was maybe 12 or 13 or 14. I don't know how old I was, but I was, a kid. And I think it was because I had never gotten it into my head that it was okay to commit mass murder. And I think I mean, I resisted all sorts of hypocrisies in our society. I never accepted religion, although I was taught it. I was just an atheist. I never accepted that we shouldn't fight. We should use words to settle our disputes, but we should invest massively in a program of killing people around the world. I mean, these sorts of contradictions just get buried in the backs of people's heads, I think, and I'm sure I swallowed a lot of them, but there's some, like war, that I just didn't, and so I opposed war, but I didn't become a peace activist. As I've said a few times recently, as I've thought about it, if there was a recruiting campaign, if there were billboards advertising jobs in peace activism, I probably would have jumped at that. But it never would have occurred to me. It's only in retrospect that I can even say that. So I went into searching for what to do with my life and studying philosophy and becoming a newspaper reporter and quitting job after job because I can't take orders. If I had to go in the military, I wouldn't have lasted an hour. And finally finding some jobs where I was working to make the world a better place, and nobody was editing me because I wasn't corporate enough. And I worked for Acorn, I worked on domestic justice issues, and then I got to working for peace groups, and there, I found some satisfaction.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said you worked for Acorn. I mean, the conservative alliances around the country really went after Acorn here a few years ago and just devastated them. Is there anything really replaced it in a sense of organizing in local communities?
Not really, and I think it's a little generous with the term conservative. I mean, Acorn was punished for registering people to vote, people who were poor and in minority neighborhoods, and that was unacceptable to one of our horrible political parties, and they destroyed Acorn with a fake documentary news clip and a bunch of fraud, and everybody dove for cover, from the president through most of the Congress members to all of the allies and the labor union on down. They came for Acorn, but I wasn't Acorn, so I said, this is what we had. I mean, it took a few more of these destructive frauds before somebody pushed back quick and hard, which I wish Acorn had done. I was gone from Acorn for a few years, and I'm not imagining I could have saved it, but I would have liked to still be there when it was attacked, because nothing has really replaced it effectively as a growing, powerful, member-driven and run organization of low-income, working-class people, multiracial.
Working in local neighborhoods, door to door.
Building by winning victories, by getting a stoplight at a dangerous intersection, then getting a living wage law, then getting a law against predatory lending, and building a statewide and regional-wide movement for justice. There's a lot of 30 years of work went into that, and they destroyed it. And a lot of the people are still active in different ways, but it's, to my knowledge, nobody's rebuilt the same or better yet.
Well, it's interesting since most of your books that I've read are dealing with the issue of war.
Yeah.
And this morning I was watching Democracy Now! Amy Goodman was interviewing David K. Johnson, who's an investigative reporter and tax analyst. And they were discussing this 2-year budget thing that just happened between the Democrats and the Republicans, Representative Paul Ryan and Senator Patty Murray. And what struck me was that David K. Johnson said something about the War and Peace report, showing that the Pentagon is getting extra $20 billion out of this deal. And we already have 42% of the world, all the money in the world, going to our military. I knew there was a lot, but I just didn't realize the amount that was going there. And the more that's going to the Pentagon, we're cutting unemployment benefits and Medicare, medical research, reducing pensions of federal workers, so on and so on, And again, we see in how the military-industrial complex keeps drawing away the wealth of the working class people in this country. And a number of your books all kind of address these issues, but I think there was a page here that I wanted to mention, which was it was in chapter, what'd you call it? It was chapter 4, Wars are not unavoidable. And it was page 125. And I just want to read a little section here because it said, it was talking about the McCormick-Dickinson Committee that was established to investigate the homegrown American fascist plot in 1933. And it goes on to talk about how they wanted to basically do a coup against Roosevelt, using sort of the bonus, the veterans looking for their bonus from the war, to use that rage to try to overthrow Roosevelt. And they and what was interesting is this was a number of the people, he kind of named names, included owners like Heinz, Birdseye, Good Tea, Maxwell House, Prescott Bush, and others. And they went to Smedley Butler, and Smedley ratted on him, and Roosevelt made a deal. And the deal was, just lay off my New Deal program, and we won't prosecute you for treason. And I was struck by that because I've read or watched interviews of Richard Wolff on the economy talking about the New Deal and how Roosevelt just went to these people and demanded that they paid. We didn't pay any more taxes. They paid the whole shit and caboodle basically for the New Deal. But it did. I could never figure out why would they go along with this. And then I saw this. And, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think that's part of why Wall Street and the 1% of that age had to go along with that, was because of that deal. I think Roosevelt made another deal with some of the more right-wing states in the Southeast, for example, that lots of military facilities would be put there. There would be lots of military jobs, and the environmental destruction and the human damage of that is ongoing. The zones that have been sacrificed to that bargain. But I think the forces that you saw at work there, pushing for fascism, pushing against fairness and justice and equality, are not entirely unlike the forces that you see at work in Washington right now. This is now, even more so than then, a nation rolling in money, among the top 5 nations in the world in wealth per capita, the biggest pile of wealth in the world. And even if you aren't going to tax the multi-billionaires, even if you aren't going to tax the corporations, even if you're going to have this disparity of wealth that is beyond medieval, that we currently have in this country, while I walk past homeless people with nowhere to live outside on the street here in Portland, Oregon, you still have a government that is nonetheless rolling in unfathomable piles of wealth, with the pretense across the aisle and across both chambers on Capitol Hill that the government's broke, which is a lie. This is a government dumping. I am convinced it's over half of military spending in the world into the U.S. military. The Swedish institute that puts it at 40-some% is not counting all military spending across all departments, of which the United States has more than any other country. We're not talking about just the Department of so-called Defense. We're talking about energy and veterans and State Department and CIA and NSA and on and on. It's about $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year, while most wealthy countries are well under $100 billion. All right, so you're talking about 10 times what other countries use to defend themselves, and most of theirs is offensive as well. While at the same time, the United States accounts for 80-some% of weapon sales to other countries. So our military industry is arming dictatorships and democracies alike around the globe, and putting our troops and our ships and our planes, speaking as an American represented by this government that doesn't represent me, in most countries around the world, 177 countries or so with U.S. troops out of 196 countries. Doesn't leave very many, and so when we hold off war with a couple of them, like Syria and Iran for the moment, that's accomplishing something.
It's impressive. Yeah, I was very impressed that people rallied around that, and it made a difference for once.
Yeah, I mean, there will be people, I guarantee you, at this event that's about to happen here in this bookstore who raise their hand and say, but isn't all hopeless? And shouldn't we go home and crawl under our beds? And I just came here to tell you all that so you will stop pretending that anything can be done in this world. And I think there is a handy response to those people that didn't exist before this past summer. And that is to say, Raytheon's stock was through the roof. The leadership of both political parties wanted those missiles to hit Syria. The president wanted those missiles to hit Syria. Everybody said we had the choice of bombing Syria or nothing, and we couldn't do nothing because look at the dying children. And public opinion forced the Congress to take a position and forced it to take the right position. And the missiles didn't go. That's remarkable. Now the guns went, the humanitarian aid didn't. You know, we didn't get everything we wanted there. They're pushing for 10 more years in Afghanistan, and we don't have the power to make that a question and then answer it. But we did stop those missiles into Syria, and we have been influential, we the people of this country, in holding off even greater hostility and antagonization and threats with Iran. These are accomplishments.
I heard Seymour Hersh speak also on Democracy Now!, and he made a comment that kind of downplayed the movement of the people, and saying that some of the real issues behind it was that the military itself thought this was a ridiculous war to go into, and that they put a lot of pressure on it. I can't believe that it's just one or the other. I think it's the combination of a lot of people rethinking what war means, and they've been in war for what now, 12 years or more, and they have seen their men, too many men killed. Too many of our veterans are coming back. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I'm, some 40 some odd years later, I'm still suffering from post-traumatic stress. I think people forget, how do you calculate? We can look at the numbers of dollars that are being spent, but how do you calculate the damage done to the human beings on this planet, to the environment that's in this, and due to war? I mean, they're still digging up mines from World War I and II, And I'm an Agent Orange victim. I had a child that was born with congenital heart disease and a number of other abnormalities, and at 3 years of age had to go for heart surgery, went into a coma for 7 weeks and died in my arms. That kind of thing, and I've been back to Vietnam, and I've met children who are suffering in the third and fourth generation that are still going on from that war. And people think that a war, somehow they don't have any responsibility to it. But if you send people there, you owe responsibility. And we need to not just take care of veterans. One of the things with post-traumatic stress, there are people come out and I have a cure. We've got this, we can do this. And for me, I don't think there is a cure for post-traumatic. You can never, unless you just do a lobotomy and brainwash somebody, but you will always have those images in your head. I live the war every day. Yeah. One thing that there is a cure for future veterans, and that is not to go to war.
Absolutely.
And that's what I love about your books, because you also talk about when war was outlawed, about the, what is it, I can't even say it, what is the Brigand
treaty?
The treaty, yes.
Kellogg-Briand.
Yeah, Kellogg-Briand Act.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, that was a whole string of questions, so just briefly on a few of them.
Sure.
I think there's no question that the military resisted the missiles into Syria, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff clearly was against it, and couldn't maintain the pretense otherwise. Did you want to take a break?
No, go ahead. You just makes it even more fun. After a decade or more of opposition to these wars and exposure of the lies and exposure of the horrors and increased education about what these wars were, that wasn't going to happen
completely segregated from people in the military, people within the military who are experiencing the wars, and in many cases even more so than the people outside the military, are going to hear the criticisms and are going to see the reality and begin to oppose the wars. And I think, in this book about the 1920s, you have a country that's very, very much against war, but we're starting now, in the past 10 years, to move in that direction again. We aren't there yet, but you start to see it. And what you had when they proposed the missiles into Syria, in part, was people with a great deal of enlightened understanding about what a horror this was and what alternatives existed, saying no, and people with a very perverse misunderstanding of what was going on, assuming that the war on Iraq was good for Iraq, benefited Iraq, the Iraqis were grateful, and the Syrians didn't deserve it, and we couldn't afford, because of that pretense of the government being broke, combined with the pretense that the wars benefit their victims, Syrians didn't deserve it. Right? So you had these humanitarian warriors saying, we can't discriminate, Syrians are good as anybody else, we must bomb them because we care about them. And you had people against spending that money for Syrians who would be ungrateful for our benevolence. And so at some point, we have to move that understanding to a more accurate, deeper understanding of the problem with war if we're going to get to where people were in the 1920s. And that's why I wrote about the creation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, went into effect in 1929, bans all war. It's still on the books, doesn't allow so-called defensive wars or UN-authorized wars, because this is pre-UN. The UN Charter actually was a legalization of two giant loopholes for wars that would be easily, and have been predictably, widened and abused. I wrote about this not because that treaty is still on the books, and because I expect it to be enforced just because we point to it, but because of the deep understanding of what was wrong with war that created it. And it created a culture across political parties and ideologies and wealth and income and race and gender in this country that was incredibly anti-war, so that everyone wanted to do away with war, and they wanted to figure out how. And criminalizing it was to be a first step. And we were then to have courts and laws and arbitration and processes of sanction and nonviolent resistance to wars that would do away with the supposed need for defensive war. I mean, these were people who saw progress happening through which we would leave behind slavery, we would leave behind blood feuds among families, we would leave behind dueling among individuals, and we wouldn't have, defensive dueling and humanitarian dueling to deal with the evil individuals. We would do the same with war. We would put war behind us as barbaric. And they tried, and it was a great first step. We got more to go.
Well, you raised some of the issues in that book about what, this theory of just war and a just war. Like many people say that about World War II. They somehow had to